Hello students, welcome to short video concept session on Medico apps. Today I'll be discussing a very basic term of tooth structure, that is cusp. Cusp is very significant as it is helpful in understanding the anatomy of the tooth. So we can say that cusp is a very important structure of the tooth. So I want to discuss this particular topic today here in our lecture. But before that, I want you to subscribe our YouTube channel by hitting the bell icon so that whenever I discuss such important terms or such important concepts, MCQs with you all, you will be notified for that. So let's start by hitting the bell icon and then understanding this short concept on cusp. So if you are asked by an examiner what exactly is cusp, how will you define it? So basically, cusp is nothing but a protuberance or an elevation which is present in the tooth structure. But formally, if you are asked to define a cusp definition, you will be defining it as an elevation or mound which is present on the crown. Now, you know that the tooth has two parts, the crown and the root. So, this cusp is basically present on the crown structure, and there is an elevation which you can see in your teeth. Now, they are only present in the posterior teeth and the canines. They are not seen in the anterior teeth. So, the definition for the cusp can be that it's an elevation or a protuberance or a mound which is seen on the crown portion of the tooth, making up the divisional part of the occlusal surface. Now, the other part of this definition of this cusp, you will understand when you see the anatomy of this cusp. So basically, if you see, if I'm drawing this anatomy of this tooth structure, what do you understand by these two structures which are evidently a little bit elevated? They are the cusp. Now, if there is an elevation and then there is a groove, definitely that means it is dividing the occlusal surface of the tooth structure. Now, each tooth basically represents a developmental lobe of the tooth. Now, as I have told you that these cusps are not present in the anterior teeth. They are basically seen in the posterior teeth and canines. So, the definition of cusp is an elevation on the crown portion of the tooth, making up a divisional part of the occlusal surface, which is basically seen in the canines and the posterior teeth. And they basically represent each of these cusps represents the developmental lobe of the tooth. So I hope you have understood the basic definition and what exactly and how exactly you will identify a cusp in the tooth if an examiner puts a tooth across you and asks you that just mention the cusp here. What is the basic structure of the cusp? Now, moving ahead with this, I want to discuss that if I am saying that the cusps are only present in the posterior teeth and the canines, how many posterior teeth or how many cusps are present in this posterior teeth and the canine? Yes, as you can feel and as you can see in your oral cavity, just go to the mirror and just see that there are some protuberance or elevation which are found in your posterior teeth and the canines. That means including the canines, premolars and the molars. Now, that structure which you are seeing, the elevation is your cusp. Okay, I hope you have understood that basic difference. Now, if I am saying that there is an elevation which is present from the canine portion till the third molar, how many elevations will you see in different teeth? Definitely, there will be different elevations and different number of elevations which you can see in each of the teeth, depending on the maxillary and mandibular and definitely moving from canine to the third molar. So each of these teeth which we are discussing today from canine to third premolar have different number of cusps present, and you should know that because that is very, very important for the anatomy of the tooth. Because whenever you will be asked the anatomy of the tooth, plus when you will be starting with the carving of the tooth, you have to know each of these tooth name and the structure and what is the importance and significance of this cusp. So starting with the first canine, the canines are basically single cusp. So we call them as cuspids. Okay, cuspids is the pet name which you can call a cusp in the canine teeth. So we call these canine teeth also as cuspids. Moving ahead from the canine, the next set of teeth are the premolars. Now premolars usually have two cusps. Now what do you understand by that? So if you see an anatomy of the premolar, which I'll be discussing further in my lecture in the next slide, you can see that there are two cusps. That means there are two elevations, and there is and in between that there's a groove which is dividing those two cusps. So they are that is why they are known as bicuspids, because they are having two cusps. But there is an exception to that. And what is that exception? So maxillary first and second premolar and the mandibular first premolar, they have two cusps, but the mandibular second premolar have three cusps. So if they have three cusps, they won't be called as bicuspids for sure. Okay, because bicuspids means bi means two. So we are only talking about the three premolars, the maxillary first and second, and mandibular first premolar, which have two cuspids. Moving ahead with the maxillary and mandibular first molar. Now these are very different, as the anatomy says that they have five cusps. The maxillary and mandibular first molars, both right side and left side. Now I am not differentiating here between the right and the left side. Here I am discussing about both the right side and the left side. So the maxillary and the mandibular first molars have five cusps. I will be showing each and everything to you in the next slide, where you will be seen with the diagram. And lastly, I want here to get a picture of what exactly and how many exactly you have to remember, that how many cusps each of these teeth have. Okay. And lastly, the maxillary and mandibular second molars have four cusps. Okay. So this is the number of teeth. This is the number of cusps which are present in the tooth we are discussing from the canine to the third molar. Okay. Now moving ahead. Now here I am not discussing about the third molar, because that is not that significant. We usually go ahead with the carvings, and we usually go ahead with the structure of the tooth which is asked in the exam is from the canines till the second molar. Okay. Now moving ahead with the tooth structure. Now if I told you in my previous slide that the canine, okay, this is the canine. As you can see, this is the canine. So canine has single cusp. So that is why they are called as cuspids. Okay. Now where is the single cusp which you can see? So this is the single cusp which you can see. As you can see here, this is the single cusp which you can see in the canine. Moving ahead with the premolars now. Now here the difference between the, now here maxillary canine and mandibular canine, I hope you have understood, because that the difference, the anatomy is not very different, because both the maxillary and the mandibular canines have single cusp. The differentiation factor starts from the premolars. The anatomy starts from the premolars, though the three teeth which I have discussed about, the maxillary first and second premolar and the mandibular first premolar, have two cusps. Now what are those two cusps? So it is very easy to remember. As you can see, this is the first premolar, this is the second premolar, and this is the mandibular first premolar. All of these have two cusps. Okay. As you can see, they have two cusps. This one and this is the second cusp. Similarly for this one, and this is the second cusp. This first cusp and this is the second cusp. Okay. Now I want to ask you a question, that if I am discussing about the maxillary premolar, what are the two surfaces you will see in the tooth? Definitely there will be a buccal surface, the surface. If this is your premolar and this is the tooth which is present in the maxillary area, the maxillary premolar, this is your buccal surface and this is your palatal surface. So what are the two cusps which you will come across in the maxillary first premolar and second premolar? So there will be two cusps which are the buccal cusp and the palatal cusp. Okay, it is very easy to remember depending on the surface of the tooth. Coming to the mandibular premolar. Now mandibular first premolar, to be very specific. Again, if I keep across this, if this is my mandibular first premolar and if I am keeping this, so this will be my buccal surface. Okay, this is the surface which is facing the buccal mucosa. So this is the buccal surface, and the inner one is the one which is facing the lingual surface, that is facing the towards the tongue, is the lingual surface. So this is the buccal cusp, and this is the this inner one is the lingual cusp. So coming across this is a buccal cusp, and this is the lingual cusp. So I hope you have understood about the three teeth I have just discussed: the maxillary first premolar, second premolar, and mandibular first premolar. Now with this, I want to also raise one point about the maxillary second premolar, that the palatal cusp is not that very sharp. Okay, it is not very sharp. So the buccal cusp is more prominent in maxillary second premolar, and same goes with the mandibular first premolar. This tooth, the buccal cusp is more longer than the lingual cusp. Okay, so I hope you have understood till here. Now moving to the exception here, the second mandibular second premolar. This is the exception we are discussing now. Now those in some tooth anatomy, there can be two cusp only in the mandibular second premolar, but it is usually seen in general population that there are three cusps. Now what are those three cusps which you can see in the mandibular second premolar? So the three cusps here are the buccal cusp. As you know, this is the buccal cusp, this is the first cusp, and this is the bigger cusp you can see in the mandibular second premolar. Now what are the other two cusp which can be seen in the mandibular second premolar? So if this is the buccal surface, what will be the inner surface? Definitely that will be the lingual surface, and this is the mesiolingual cusp, and this is the distolingual cusp. Okay, so mesiolingual cusp is little bigger than the distolingual cusp. Okay, now how do you define this mesiolingual and distolingual? So the surface which is towards the mesial side. Okay, now again, if this is the second premolar, this was your buccal surface, this was your lingual surface. Now the surface which is towards the midline is the medial surface, and the surface which is towards the posterior surface, towards the first molar, is your distal surface. So this cusp which is present towards the mesial surface will be mesiolingual cusp, and the tooth and the surface which is, or the cusp which is present towards the first molar, is distal. Okay, so that will be distolingual cusp. And similarly, if you see, if this is your first molar here, okay, this is your first molar, so this will be your distal surface. So this is this distal plus the lingual surface. So we will call this cusp as the distolingual cusp. So I hope you have understood that what are the three cusps which you are see in the second mandibular second premolar: the buccal cusp, which is the largest one, and other than that the mesiolingual cusp, which is bigger than the distolingual cusp. So I hope you have understood the anatomy, the cusp anatomy till the second premolar, the mandibular second premolar. With this, now I am going to shift to the maxillary and mandibular molars. Now that is also very, very important for carving purpose, and when you will move ahead in your coming years, when you will understand the anatomy for the root and everything, you have to understand the anatomy of the cusp also, and you have to remember these names. And genuinely you have to remember these names because these are actually asked in the examination also. So we will start with the maxillary teeth first. So this is the maxillary first molar, and this is the maxillary, and this is the mandibular first molar. Now, as I told you that maxillary and mandibular first molar have 5 cusps. So what are the 5 cusps you will say? So coming across in this diagram, as you can see in this image, this is the buccal surface, this is the palatal surface. Towards the palate is your palatal surface. So how we will define? Again, we will say the same thing, that towards the mesial surface, we will define that cusp. This is your mesiobuccal cusp. This is your distobuccal cusp, which is facing and which is towards the distal surface. And similarly, going to that is from the buccal surface. Now coming to the palatal surface, so there will be mesiopalatal and distopalatal. That means towards the mesial surface it is mesiopalatal, and towards the distopalatal it is the distopalatal cusp. Now, I hope you have understood about these four cusps: the mesiobuccal, the distobuccal, the mesiopalatal, and the distopalatal. Now, which is the fifth cusp here? So, I have already discussed with you in a short video session about cusp of Carabelli. Now, cusp of Carabelli, as I had mentioned in that lecture, that it is basically and mainly present in the maxillary first molar. So, coming with that video and taking the reference for the cusp of Carabelli, what you can see in the maxillary first molar, the fifth cusp, that is the supplemental cusp, and that is the cusp of Carabelli. So this is the cusp of Carabelli, which is an extra cusp or the supplemental cusp which is seen in the maxillary first molar. Now, moving ahead with the mandibular first molar, as I have told you, even this has the 5 cusps. Now, the only difference here is that the mandibular first molar does not have the supplemental cusp, that is the cusp of Carabelli is not present in the mandibular first molar. So, what are the 5 cusps? So, the 4 cusps are similar. What are those 4 cusps? Only the difference comes is that the above one had palatal, the below one will be lingual because it is facing towards the tongue. Yes, the lingual portion is, the tongue portion is your lingual portion. So again, if you see, this is the mesiobuccal, this is the distobuccal, this is the mesiolingual, and this is the distolingual cusp we are discussing. And the fifth cusp here is the distal cusp, and this is the smallest cusp you will see in the mandibular first molar. So I hope you have understood the cusp anatomy for the maxillary and mandibular first molar. Now moving ahead with the second molar, maxillary and mandibular, they have only 4 cusps. So you have to remember it that canines have 1, the premolars have 2, but the exception is mandibular second premolar. Then coming to the maxillary first molar and mandibular first molar have 5 cusps, and lastly coming to the mandibular and maxillary second molar have 4 cusps. So what are the 4 cusps? Very easy to know. In the maxillary, definitely the mesiobuccal, distobuccal, the mesiolingual and the distolingual. That is for the mandibular. Now coming same for the maxillary, it will be mesiopalatal and distopalatal. And if you come across in the mandible, it will be mesiobuccal, distobuccal, mesiolingual and distolingual. So these will be the 4 cusps which you will come across in the second molar, the maxillary and mandibular second molar. So I hope now you can easily differentiate the cusp and what is exactly a cusp present in the tooth. Now, lastly, before ending, there are few questions which are being asked on these cusp also in MCQs, and one of the questions which I came across in my examination was the cusp which was asked for the deciduous teeth. So definitely the deciduous teeth just have the first and the second molar. They don't have the premolars, and neither the canines have the cusp. So here the first molar has 4 cusps. And what are those? The first molar, the maxillary and mandibular deciduous first molar does not have the supplemental cusp. That means the cusp of Carabelli is not present. So if cusp of Carabelli is not present, automatically there will be 4 cusps. What are those 4 cusps? The mesiobuccal, the distobuccal, the mesiolingual and the distolingual. Similarly, moving to the second molar, they have 5. This is a very opposite thing. In permanent, you will see that second molar has 4 cusps and the first molar has 5 cusps. But in deciduous, you will see that the first molar has 4 cusps, whereas the second molar has 5 cusps. And what are those 5 cusps? Definitely the mesiobuccal, the distobuccal, okay, the mesiolingual, the distolingual. This is your distal, okay, distal cusp, and this is your distolingual. So these are the 5 cusps you will come across in the deciduous teeth. So I hope you have understood the differentiation factor for the cusp of the permanent and the deciduous teeth. Now, before winding up this topic, I want you to subscribe my YouTube channel, the BDS Express YouTube channel. And in case you want such kind of daily updates on important dental topics, I want you to join our exclusive WhatsApp group. And the link for that group is www.medicoapps.org/group. And the link of this group is also given in the description below in this video. For now, thank you so much. Good day, good luck.